Now, one of the things that is very important to understand about a cultural perspective is it tends to challenge the things that we take for granted. It tends to challenge the things that we assume to be true and therefore produces counterintuitive claims. Like the claim, somebody made the claim, there's no increase in the prevalence of autism. We're just counting it better, whatever. But it's, how many people knew people with autism 30 years ago? Not that many. Go back 50 years. Did anybody know anybody with autism? Today, we know so many people with autism. We see people. I saw people at the aquarium yesterday with my daughter that I know have autism. Take these claims, just as analogies. It's not natural for women to menstruate once a month. Doesn't that sound crazy? There was no homosexuality in ancient Greece, or in Europe or North America until after 1892. That sounds pretty crazy too, right? Before 1800, there was only one sex in Europe, male. Yet each of these claims is in fact true. We evolved as people who had many children, who nursed frequently. And so if we look at the best models for what things were like maybe thousands of years ago, say the Dogon of Mali living in a very rural area, they have 1/4 the number of menses that a typical Canadian or American woman does. What is natural is not to menstruate every month, but we evolved with a whole series of factors that influence it. There were men who had sex with men in ancient Greece, but it was not categorized as any different from any other form of sex, as long as it was appropriate sex, say between a citizen and a non-citizen, or a man and a woman, or a man and a boy. Before 1800, scientists in Europe did not believe that there were two distinct sexes. There were two genders, but they were simply variations of the same basic sex, which was male, and women were imperfect men. In fact, if you look at anatomical drawings from the 1500s, 1600s, 1700s, they're all of women, because that was the problem to be explained. Why is it that there are these people who don't look like men? Why is there a different phenotype? So each one of these claims is true. Now, Abraham Lincoln, whose name probably has never been mentioned in an autism lecture, had erotic, intimate relationships, particularly a long-standing one with a man named Joshua Speed. They slept together in the same bed for several years. But there was no model or concept of it. So, quote-unquote, heterosexuals didn't have to fear being called a homosexual. In fact, the word doesn't even appear in the English language until 1892 because it had to await the concept of heterosexuality to be developed by psychologists. And so also when we think about autism, well, did autism exist in 1600? Well, nobody talked about it necessarily. It doesn't mean that there weren't people with what we today might refer to as autism, but it wasn't classified, categorized, and set apart or marked. One thing you find interesting is that when you don't have a model or a concept of something, you tend not to have fear of it because it doesn't yet exist. So take the kind of homoerotic relationships that existed in the 16, 17, 1800s, which were not stigmatized in the same way as they are today. One only needs to look at the University of Pennsylvania baseball team in the 19th century, in which people are sort of lazing around and lying on top of each other, and then look at my own university's baseball team today. The history of psychiatry is like the history of homosexuality or sex or the body. It is a history of order and classification and the development of ideas of normality and abnormality. The doctor or the expert in Western civilization emerges first not as a person who possesses knowledge, but as a person who could establish a certain order. In other words, the history of psychiatry didn't really proceed on the accumulation of knowledge as much as on the coattails of modernity. The rise of institutions in Europe, schools, prisons, hospitals, accompanied the rise of capitalism, and along with capitalism, a new way of ordering the world. New modes of production don't just change how we behave, new modes of production also change the way we think and organize our ideas. And what changed from the earliest times of psychiatry, from Pinel, who's credited with the first humane treatment of the mentally ill, to Freud, was less than about producing new knowledge than about producing a new system of ordering knowledge, of which psychiatry was one part. With the rise of academic disciplines and medicine, psychiatry became organized and coherent as a distinct body of knowledge. The DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, is a very good example of this. It's a system of classification, certainly not based on very many empirical phenomena. In fact, no etiology, with the exception of one or two disorders, such as grief reaction, where you can say that there's some known cause. It is also a form of governance, or psychiatric governmentality, if you will, not to mention a commodity. It's difficult to be in the fields that any of you are in, if you're professionals in healthcare or mental health care, without owning a copy of the latest DSM, because the DSM owns the classification of mental illness. So our academic disciplines emerge in particular contexts for particular reasons, and it's no surprise that the word discipline is used to refer to the various components of academia, because our disciplines correct us, they control us, they keep us on a certain track, they're organized hierarchically, and they involve a certain kind of surveillance that inflicts penalties or micro-penalties on us, lateness and absences, talking out of turn, not citing the appropriate references, and so on. And for many people, it is inconceivable to imagine the world organized in any other way, and that's because we take for granted what actually is a cultural construction. These things become naturalized, as do the oppositions between things like male and female, right and wrong, good and bad, normal, abnormal, rational, irrational, expert and lay. Knowledge becomes a form of power and governance, and sometimes that power is very hard to see. Other times it's not so difficult to see. We know in Canada, for instance, what kind of role a Supreme Court decision in 2004 in British Columbia had on how people think about and manage their worlds in which there is a person with a disability. Science can be integrated as a form of political power. But my emphasis here is not on the obvious, it's on the less obvious forms of knowledge and science as a way of shaping the way that we think.